grateful for your time and your willingness to come and hear the presentation. This is a stakeholder information meeting with our consultant to explain methodologies and assumptions that went into the impact fee study. And we have a few of our team members here. Rob Owen is our Public Works Director. Mike Mearsman is our Parks Director. Where's Jack? I saw Jack. I guess he. Jack Plenty, who is our street superintendent, or actually, I demoted him. He's the Assistant Public Works Director. Tina Moline is the Finance Director. And so, again, we're happy to have you all here. Excited that we're actually able to meet in person. This is only the second time we've been able to meet with a group. First was yesterday for the first time since April. So it's actually nice to see faces and be able to be in person for a change. Jack, thank you for joining us. As I have been working with Miss Tina, really she has been the one that has been working with all the departments to gather information. She's worked very closely with the consultant. I think I'll let her do the introductions on that part. I just wanted to let you know kind of how we got here. In 2019, early 2019, we met with the City Council in a couple of public meetings talking about budget, talking about capital projects and revenue streams. And one of the things that we talked about with the council was impact fees and the need for new growth to pay for impact and to moving into the community. And so through those conversations, the council basically tasked us with identifying a consultant, working with the identified consultant, and bringing forward an impact fee study. So we've been actively doing that since late 2019, and we're on schedule for our first public hearing on this by the end of 2020. There's quite a lengthy time that will be covered in the presentation as far as advertising and waiting between meetings and stuff that will be covered. But with that, just kind of the background, I'll turn it over to Ms. Tina to just do introductions. And yes, thank you. And that reminds me. So this room is laid out 6 feet spacing between the seats. As long as you stay seated, you're welcome to have your masks off. It's only when you get up and move around that we ask that the social distancing can't be accomplished, that you need to put a mask on. For the question and answers portion, we're going to pass this mic around. This is being recorded. There's people that were unable to make it today, so we want to make this available for information for anybody who wasn't able to come today. So the cameras will be moving around, and we want to make sure that everybody speaks clearly into the microphone so that it's a good recording, so that those that weren't able to participate live can still get the flavor and information and questions, because one of the important parts of the stakeholder meeting is being able to take questions and understand them, and be able to give an answer back, or at a future time be able to produce some question and answer fact sheets on this as well. So anyway, with that, Ms. Tina.
So thank you so much again for attending. And again, if you have questions throughout the meeting, please just indicate so somehow so that I can disinfect, pass around the mic for you to speak into. But with that, I would like to introduce Carson Bice, who is the president of Tischler Bice, our consulting firm that was hired to perform our development fee study. We worked closely with him and with his senior fiscal economic analyst, Ben Griffin, who is actually on the Zoom call today as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Bice. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Is this on? Everybody hear me all right?
Should be.
Yeah. Well, thank you for Sure, that's fine. Yeah, not at all. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. We have found it very helpful in the impact fee studies that we've done across the country to have a stakeholder committee as part of that process. One, to answer questions you guys have about the technical methodology and the assumptions that go into the study, but also, any other questions you or concerns you have from a policy or administration perspective. And it's important to note that this is not really intended to be a forum to talk about, whether impact fees are bad, good, indifferent. That's more of a political question, which will be answered down the road. This is intended purely to be, to present information about the report and solicit questions in response to solicit answers in response to those questions. And as Tina said, we have Ben Griffin on the phone who can answer any of the technical questions that come up. A little bit about us in general. Our firm's based in Bethesda, Maryland, and Boise, Idaho, and we've done more impact fees than anybody in the country, and we've certainly done more impact fees in Arizona than any firm. And in fact, I think we've done over 35 communities under the new Impact Fee Act that was adopted in 2012. We do like to keep this informal. This is the first COVID in-person stakeholder meeting I've done. Usually, it's a round table, and I'm not standing presenting to you. So I do want to keep it informal. So if at any point on any slide, if somebody has a question, feel free to interrupt me or raise your hand, ask the question. Because a lot of times I know when I've had to sit through these presentations, when you have to save up your questions for 20 minutes later, sometimes you forget. So let's keep it informal. If you've got a question, answer it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about development fee basics this morning, talk about the land use assumptions that went into the analysis, talk about the different components of what is called the IIP, or the Infrastructure Improvement Plan. Also discuss briefly the wastewater capacity fees that we're doing, and then give you a summary and talk about the path forward. As some of you may or may not know, the city did have impact fees about 12, 14 years ago, I believe, and they were eliminated during the Great Recession. And the wastewater development impact fee remained in place. Now, in the interim, what has happened is the state of Arizona has passed a new Impact Fee Act in 2012, known as SB 1525, that dramatically changed the landscape for jurisdictions in terms of how they calculate and implement impact fees. I'm going to summarize the big changes here. One is we have to now produce 3 integrated separate products. One is what we refer to as the land use assumptions. Has to cover a 10-year period, and essentially it tells the story of the city of Kingman's grown over time. That here's where we are now in terms of population, housing units, employment, et cetera. That growth is going to continue, and here's the projection for the next 10 years. So that's what we call the land use assumptions. And then we have the IIP, which contains the cost assumptions and capital improvement assumptions used to calculate the development fees. And then we actually have the development fee study as well. In terms of level of service, there were some changes to the definitions and requirements. One is we can't charge impact fees based on a higher level of service than what the city provides today. We can't use the impact fees to correct existing deficiencies. And there's also limitations now on what cities and towns in Arizona can assess development fees for. They eliminated the general government fee for sort of administrative complexes. They've reduced what you can do with parks and recreation impact fees. They limited the size of parks to 30 acres and the community centers to 3,000 square feet. They've limited libraries to 10,000 square feet. They've eliminated public safety training facilities. And so it's a completely different impact fee environment than the city found itself in 10 to 12 years ago. Also, another big change is how the city has to go about adopting the impact fees. It's a very long process. It's a minimum of 225 days. The first round has just begun, which is the advertisement and public hearings on the land use assumptions and the infrastructure improvement plan. After that, we go to round 2, which is the advertising and public hearing of the actual development fees. which can be modified during that time frame of public advertisement. We also have to do revenue projections and discuss or include any required offsets, which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. I mentioned capacity fees. The city did have a water impact fee, which was not eliminated, but with the adoption of SB 1525 in 2012, it basically became a grandfathered fee. And now that we're updating this fee, we now have to comply with the act or use the other part of the Arizona revised statutes, which is related to water and sewer charges related to municipal utilities. And so we have to do that because the city is charging that capacity fee or impact fee today outside of the city limits, and under SB 1525 we can't do that, but we can with capacity fees for utilities. So that's the real difference there.
Carson, can I just interrupt real
Sure.
fast? So I just want to make a clarification that it's wastewater impact fees that
what did
we've
I say,
continued
water?
to. Yes.
I always use that interchangeably. Sorry about that. But it also, the wastewater utilities also have a very different adoption timeline compared to the impact fees. It's much more streamlined. But also, we recommend that if you do capacity fees, you basically treat them like impact fees, do your annual reporting and that sort of thing like you would. And we've already talked about that. I want to talk briefly before we get into the numbers. There's 3 different ways we can calculate impact fees. And the way to think about it is the past, the present, and the future. So if we look to the past, we basically are making an argument that the infrastructure system has been oversized in order to accommodate new development. You'll see this in the utility capacity charge, the wastewater capacity charge. And a good example of that is if you have a wastewater treatment plant and it's been sized at 10 million gallons a day and it's currently operating at 6, the new development's going to buy into that remaining 4 MGD of capacity. You can also do this with public safety buildings. If you just built a new police station 2 or 3 years ago that's been oversized to serve new development, you can basically assess an impact fee to recoup growth share of that debt service. So that's what we mean if you hear us say cost recovery or buy-in approach. We also use what we call a consumption-based or incremental expansion approach, and that's really looking at the present and how we get the fees using this approach. It's much more formulaic. It's based on looking at your asset base for the particular infrastructure category, whether it's police, fire, or parks, to get measurements in terms of how many park acres do we have per person, or how many square feet of police station do we have per person and job, et cetera. And then look at, well, what does it take to replicate that infrastructure today? For instance, what does it cost us on average to buy an acre of parkland? What does it cost us on average to improve an acre of parks or build a tennis court, build a basketball court, et cetera? So it provides flexibility, and again, we cannot use the impact fees to correct existing deficiencies under this approach. So a good example of that is parks. We work with a lot of communities where they say, well, our adopted level of service is X, but we're really at Y. Well, we have to go with the Y level of service standard. When we look to the future, we call that a plan-based approach. Usually it's based on some sort of adopted master plan, usually roads or utilities, that has a funding component to it. The fees may be higher under this approach, but it leaves the city more vulnerable to, or the general fund more vulnerable, because it relies on that development projection that we have to make as part of the land use assumptions. So if development doesn't happen as we projected, you still have to build that CIP. It's just that the revenue isn't there, and so through impact fees, so we have to use sales tax or property tax or some other revenue source in order to make ourselves whole. I mentioned offsets or credits, as they're also known. This is required because within the methodology, we have to ensure that new development doesn't pay twice, once through the impact fee and then again through a future stream of revenue. And that future stream of revenue could be utility rates, it could be sales tax, it could be property tax, it could be other charges. And so in other words, if you hand me $4,000, you've paid your fair share. If you're also paying other revenues that go to fund that exact same that you paid me the impact fee for, I have to give you credit for that. We also have to give credit for, after the fees are adopted, There could be credit situations that arrive where, a developer comes in the door and as part of their development, donates or dedicates land that could be used for parks as part of the development project. So the developer has to be credited for that because part of the impact fee calculation has that land component. And you would work that out through a development agreement. Now let's turn to the actual, go ahead. No. Because there's a difference between general revenue and dedicated revenue. Currently you have well, there's several ways to do credits. One is if you've got existing debt service, you would give a credit. Second is if you have dedicated revenue that is funding something specifically. Now, essentially what the city's doing is they're funding the CIP on a catch-as-catch-can basis. If you've got leftover money, they transfer it over. That's very different than having a dedicated funding source that goes to fund one facility type. Very different.
Yeah, so as an example, if we had a dedicated sales tax to building parks, if we had, it was 1% of the sales tax went to building parks, then that is a bookmark, would be dedicated funding for parks that would result in a credit. But because general fund, because sales tax is not dedicated to a specific item, then it doesn't qualify for credit.
Right, so essentially the impact fee is replacing that. Other examples of some communities we work with has a dedicated debt levy for property tax, and so we would have to assess the credit that. Yes, sir.
Currently, we develop a new phase or a new, we are required to.
Okay. Oh, that's all right. It's my fault for saying you could interrupt me. But this one's on, right? Yeah, okay, yeah.
So currently, as a developer, when we develop a new community or phase, we are footing the bill to improve arterial streets, widening them, and putting those in. So would we get a credit back for those improvements that we're already paying for?
That's an excellent question, and that's more of an administrative issue that Mr. Faga may weigh in on. But essentially what's happening now is it's somewhat of an arbitrary system where the impact fees are more, it's hard to work into your pro forma what you're going to have to spend because that ask could be very different for different projects, whereas the impact fees are more of a known entity. But yes, if you are making improvements today that are system-wide improvements, not improvements that are required as part of the subdivision ordinance that are, like a turn lane into your development, you would get credit for that. So when I mean system improvements, I mean, arterial capacity that everybody benefits from, park capacity that everybody benefits from.
And would that include extending sewer lines?
It could, yes.
So to answer that question, typically, if there is a requirement, so that let's just say, I'll just use some road widths. They're not, I have no idea what the standard road, but if a road width is, let's say, 45 feet, and the city needed to have that become a collector, and it needed to grow to 65 feet, as an example, that difference would be a credit conversation. If you have a sewer line that's being extended past other people's property, in the past, we've had a reimbursement process that developer extends the sewer line and then has to wait to get buy-in from people who connect to it. The impact fee system would basically recognize that and give credit to you so that you weren't waiting for someone to connect to it. So that's how I've always dealt with impact fees, and I would assume that that's what we're going to do as a community as well. So, yep.
get my glasses on so I can read these numbers. Okay. So when we look at the land use assumptions, which is a projection of development out 10 years, we see that in terms of population, we're projecting an increase of almost 6,000 new residents, and that equates to about 2,530 new housing units. And as you would expect, given the housing trends here, majority of these are single-family units. Employment is projected to increase by 1,166 new jobs, which equates to about 456,000 square feet of additional non-residential activity. Now, turning to the first fee, which is fire, we are recommending a citywide service area for this fee. The components are the actual brick and mortar station space, apparatus, and then fire communications equipment. We're taking that consumption base or present situation methodology when we calculate this fee. Now, when we define the level of service standards in the report, what we do is we apply that to those land use assumptions that you just saw right here in order to estimate demand. So if those projections held true, then based on current levels of service, growth would demand 3,000 square feet, or about $1.2 million in growth-related fire station square footage. Now, the city could choose to build 10,000 square feet of space over the next 10 years, but new growth would only pay for 3,000 of that. So anything above that 3,000 would be on the city's dime and would represent the city making a conscientious decision to increase the level of service within the community. Same thing with apparatus. Growth generates demand for about 1.5 pieces of apparatus at about $1 million. Of course, the city could choose to buy 4 pieces of apparatus. The new growth would only pay for 1.5. And growth would demand about $31,000 in communications equipment. Now, when we look at the actual fees themselves, the top part of the table represent the cost per person or cost per job based on the level of service standards and the cost assumptions in the report. And so that generates a fee of about $893 per single family unit, $577 for multifamily, and about $547 for mobile home and $372 for all others. I'm not going to focus too much on the non-residential unless somebody has some particular questions, because when we tend to talk about fee amounts, we tend to focus on that single family number. But I will say that because office and institutional have the highest employment densities or the highest number of employees per 1,000 square feet, they do generate the highest fee per square foot. In terms of parks and recreation, this is citywide as well. We took an incremental expansion approach or consumption-based approach for this. The components include park land as well as the park improvements on park land, and the 10-year estimated demand would be from new growth about 23 acres of additional parkland at a cost of about $2.3 million, and then the city would have to spend about $2.7 million on additional park amenities or improvements. And when we look at the draft fee amounts, single family is about $1,954, followed up by multifamily at $1,262, mobile home at $1,197, and all other housing types at $814. The police development fee, a citywide, yeah, go ahead.
And I'm more than happy to wait till the end. Want to roll through? I just have some questions about the methodology.
Sure.
So a couple questions that I had. One, if we were looking at the number of acres that are allocated to different parks, one question I had was related to why some parks were left off versus some were included. Was that determined?
Ben, you're on the line. You can answer that question, right?
Yeah, so really we were looking at, the larger parks. So we didn't want to include, any pocket parks or the smaller neighborhood parks. So we're really looking at the community parks that serve, the broader city.
Yeah. So one of the things you have to, I mentioned here on this slide, you have a citywide service area. The danger of including those pocket parks that Ben mentioned is they have a very limited benefit. And so it requires cities to set up these little collection and expenditure zones because they're truly, neighborhood-specific parks. And what happens is, one, it becomes an administrative burden and nightmare, and two, you only collect these little pots of money and never enough to really do anything. And so, and the other thing is many cities have gotten away or gotten out of that pocket park business, and the focus is on these larger parks. So typically, we don't include those. We also usually don't include sort of one of special purpose facilities that you're never likely to replicate again as well.
So one question I have related to, I'll use Southside Park as an example. It's listed at 51 acres. Based on using the county GIS maps, I estimate that less than half of that is developed land, and the vast majority is undeveloped desert. Yet the study is using the full 51 acres as parkland that is allocated or counted as developed land, for where we're saying that it's worth $80,000 an acre.
Yeah, and I'm going to attempt to answer this, Ben. Correct me if I get anything wrong. Well, first of all, we're not making a distinction between active and passive parkland. It's parkland. And the city has the option, you see here on the slide that they have to make $2.7 million in investment and improvements. Those improvements can happen either on new parcels that are purchased, or they can happen on the parcel that you just mentioned. And it's fairly common for communities to have parks that not only offer active recreation opportunities, but also open space and trails and passive recreation opportunities.
So another couple questions just on the 2 pages later, the improvements, estimating the cost of some of these incremental expansions. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this is listing the current available soccer fields, baseball fields.
Right.
So where do we have 12 soccer fields in Kingman?
That's really a question for parks.
That's including the areas that are used for soccer as well, and potential areas that could be used for soccer, like Southside Park, the field at Southside Park, that's a football field, could be used for soccer. And the 3 fields that we have at Centennial, and there's areas at Monsoon Park that could be used as soccer, and it is used for soccer for practices, and also the outfields that are ball fields that they use for soccer as well. That's, I think, how we came up with that, I believe.
Well, there's another one up here if someone wants to use that.
So I feel that's a little bit of double dipping. We just talked about using the same space that are used for baseball fields for soccer fields. And as far as the level of service, I feel like Monsoon Park was mentioned. I'm not sure if you've been there, but it's not exactly level, and it's pretty rough grass. So I find the estimate of adding an additional soccer park at near $400,000 to be grossly exaggerated if we're looking at the same level of service as what is currently being provided. Currently, it's literally a grass retention basin. So I don't think there's any way we could really validate these numbers that are here on this page.
I just texted Ben in my office. We tend to agree, and we're going to relook at that. And this is a perfect example of why we have these types of meetings, to get this type of feedback. So you're right. We will go back and make sure we're not double counting, counting a soccer field that's also used as a baseball field, because it has to be one or another, right? So.
Yeah, and again, the same quality level.
Right. Can't charge for a Cadillac if you're building a Chevy.
One example of that is like on the baseball fields, we're saying those are worth $15,000, and then the soccer field we're saying are worth $380,000. Multiply that by 12, $4.5 million. So, just looking at soccer fields alone, it's overstating, our parks improvements by like 35% or something. So yeah, that that one's pretty big, but there's maybe others as well that need to be considered.
What was that? Was that a question?
Oh, I was just saying, that's just the one that we specifically
Okay.
looked at, but maybe there's others that are being double counted as well.
Again, this is the type of feedback we're looking for, and we will be reconvening with Parks folks to confirm these things.
Just real quickly, all of our areas of the park, soccer fields, all of them are multi-use fields. The football is used for, at Centennial Park, the soccer fields are used for football. They're used for phys ed classes. They're used for everything. And also, the numbers that he's talking about are referring to lighting them as well, and that's kind of how we got to some of those numbers.
Yeah, and so that's a good point, and maybe what we should be doing is classifying those as multi-use fields.
Sure, but they're not all lit, so there'd be a very varied distinction between those. I don't feel like we can really call Monsoon Park anything other than empty grass. But I just feel like many of the assumptions are overstated. Being in the construction business, we're very keyed into what it takes to develop an acre and $80,000 to develop park acres when some of that can be left undeveloped, as you were speaking, seems also overstated on the 2 pages before, estimating the cost per an acre for site preparation. And if that's counted there, once you have that site preparation, it makes these numbers for the incremental expansion even more inflated. So
We'll take a look at that. Any more questions before we move on to police? So moving on to the police fee, this is a citywide service area as well. The components we have are the actual station space, the vehicles and equipment, and the communications equipment. If we apply the level of service standards to the growth projections, we generate the need, or growth generates the need, for an estimated 1,600 additional square feet, cost about $650K, 9 vehicles at $450K, and about $50K in communications equipment expenditures. And the fees, or the draft fees, for the residential units range from a high of $413 for single family to a low of $172 for all other housing types. Streets, this is a citywide service area as well. There's 2 components for this one. It includes arterial capacity as well as improved intersections. We've taken a consumption-based approach for this fee as well. And when we apply the level of service to our traffic model that we developed for this assignment, we generate the need for about 5 lane miles at a cost of about $4.8 million and about $2.4 million in improved intersections over the next 10 years. And that results in fees for a single-family house of about $2,533, $1,494 for an apartment, $1,662 for a mobile home, and then $1,105 for all other housing types. And as you would expect from a commercial perspective or a non-residential perspective, retail and commercial activities generate the highest fee per square foot due to the high trip generation rates there. Now finally, wastewater capacity. Service area here, as we discussed earlier, is very different since the city provides, wastewater. The city provides wastewater to areas outside the city into Mojave County, and so the service area is both. The components are treatment, and we use that buy-in or cost recovery method for that. We used a plan-based approach for interceptors, and we did have to give an offset for debt on the current treatment facility. So there's a rate credit there. And then the 10-year demand for treatment's about $5.7 million in terms of cost recovery. The city would have to spend about $11.8 million interceptors, and the total credit that's being generated is about $1.7 million. That's discounted off of the fees. And as we discussed earlier, the city does have a current wastewater fee, and the average is about $1,456. It's done by the number of fixtures. And when we look at this new table that's done by meter size, that represents what we call the single-family equivalent, or the 1.0 capacity ratio, which is the equivalent of a 3/4 inch meter. And so a single-family meter would be $3,562, and then would range upwards as the meter sizes go up. Now, this table shows the full freight, so to speak, when you add up all the fees together. I'm going to separate these out into what we'll call the general fund fees of fire, parks, police, and streets, which total about $5,793 per single-family unit. Now, when you add in the capacity fee, and assuming that 3/4 inch meter of $3,562, a typical single-family house would have an impact fee of about $9,355 if the study was adopted at these maximum allowable rates. Now, moving on to timeline, we're going to advertise, I always forget we're in October already. The land use assumptions in IIP have been advertised, and there's a 60-day gestation process there before we go to the public hearing in December. It would be adopted in January, 30 days after that. Then in February, we would have or advertise the development fees and have a public hearing on the development fee study, with adoption to occur sometime in March, and then it would take 75 days, according to the Impact Fee Act, before those fees could go into effect. And so the estimated effective date would be June of next year. And with capacity fees, we have a much shorter timeline here. You advertise in October, adopt notice of intent in December, have the public hearing in March, and then the fees would go into effect in June, as well as, or to match the development fee adoption. And with that, we're happy to answer any other questions you guys may have about the study or the timeline or the process going on from here.
Hello. So in a very early slide, it talked about whether or not the development fees could be assessed to a location outside the city limits. I just want clarification. So these fees we're talking about could be assessed to a building outside the city limits, or no?
No, that's why we're taking the capacity fee route for the wastewater fee, because the city does provide service outside.
Gotcha.
And under the Development Fee Act, you can't collect outside your jurisdiction. However, under that section of ARS, which I forget the number, which deals with utility rates and charges, you can do capacity charges, system development charges, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Utility outside.
Okay. Back on, well, let's go to the streets. So maybe for the streets department, but my understanding is that many of the projects listed are already needed and have been needed for years, maybe a decade. So that would lead me to believe that the current population of Kingman has demanded some of these improvements. And then we're putting, maybe my understanding of the calculation is wrong, but then we're trying to put 100% of that burden onto future new build residents when it was already in demand. So even if no one ever moves to Kingman ever again, or no house is ever built, the city already needs to do a bunch of the street improvement projects. And maybe that relates also to parks and to fire and police as well. So I'm having a hard time connecting. Like, one that sticks out for sure, Eastern Street. Since I was a kid, that's needed to be expanded, and it's never been done because it's a big dollar amount, $10.6 million. And that's needed to be done. Is that being included, and is that fair that it be included?
So, and Ben, jump in here if I misspeak. But just to your point, you said that improvement alone is $10.8 million, right? You're only going to collect $4.8 million total from growth. So you can make an argument that for any of these infrastructure categories, there's been a need, right? We're not where we want to be in terms of level of service. It's just a matter of, over time, if we'd have done this study 10 years ago, growth would have paid more for that road improvement that you just mentioned. It's going to pay less now because of the level of service has declined over time. And so I think you'll find that, I mean, the impact fees for streets aren't gonna come close to covering all the street needs.
Yeah, I know, wouldn't, but it doesn't seem like it's meeting the spirit of what the intention of the impact fees are, which is to pay for future infrastructure that the new growth would trigger or demand. So Eastern Street is already fully in demand, so it doesn't seem like it's meant for that. It shouldn't be used for something that's been needed for a long time and the city's already wanted to fund. And now just because we could have a revenue source that could cover it doesn't mean we should use that. And it doesn't seem like in the state statute of 1525 that that's what it's meant for, to pay for old projects that we've been wanting to do.
Well, I mean, I would argue otherwise. I would say that, one, your street network works as a system, and so you tend not to look at individual streets in isolation with the method that we employed, which is what is the level of service on the city's complete arterial network, and then we get that growth-related demand. And just because the street's been needed for years doesn't mean that growth doesn't pay a portion of that street. Just like you can make the argument that certain parks have been needed for years, because we'd like to have our level of service at 5 acres per thousand, but it's now, I don't know, I'm just gonna make up a number, it's now at 3. So that demand has already been there, but it's based on a snapshot in time, and this is our level of service. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't know what the complete number is for the CIP bin. You may have that at your fingertips, but just, I mean, that road alone is more than double what you're gonna collect from growth on impact fees for streets.
Yeah, so the total is 38 million, and we're only including 20-something million as eligible for impact fees. And then of that 22 lane miles, we're saying that growth would only be responsible for about 5 of those lane miles.
Right.
So only a small share.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so the way to look at that, I mean, that's the city spending $500,000 a year on roads. And that's not a huge amount of money, given its overall needs for roads.
Yeah. As far as the general calculations for each category, so let's go to fire, let's say. I'm trying to understand, when we start calculating, are we assuming that the current square footage and trucks and firemen and stuff, that is currently at capacity at 100% for the current population?
It doesn't matter. Under that approach, the level of service is what it is. It could be deficient, you could have excess capacity, but it is the level of service that's being provided. And so it's a policy decision of whether you, I mean, if you think that someone can make the argument that there's excess capacity, I mean, that's a complex argument to make because of the lag time that it takes to build facilities that, if you build a park tomorrow, all of a sudden your level of service spikes, but it's going to be 4 or 5 years before you build another park. And so it's this continual up and down, which is why it's dangerous to say our level of service that we're going to base the impact fees on is 5 acres per thousand, because we're only at 3.5. So that's actually a more conservative approach because of that lag lead time.
So it is in each category, police, parks, fire, it is kind of assuming whatever we have now is basically operating at the level to cover the current population, and that's what we're going to project going forward.
The way to think of it, it's not a qualitative assessment. It's a quantitative assessment.
Yeah. So theoretically, if, I know this isn't the case, but if the fire department was over capacity right now, like they had excess capacity, we'd be projecting additional excess that we wouldn't need to, but it would be hard to evaluate that, you're saying. And
Well, that's a great example, actually. Let's just say, and I can't remember off the top of my head how many stations the city has, but let's just say that
I think it's
the city,
4.
Okay, so let's say there's 4 stations, and the 4th station was just built 2 years ago. you may have an argument that you do have excess capacity and you would do a buy-in approach for that. But if it's a situation where, because of where growth's occurring and the fact that fire really has a redundancy built into it, where one station's covering for this one while this one's on other calls, that you're going to need to expand infrastructure, which is why you take the incremental expansion or a plan-based approach for future stations' needs.
So looking at some of the methodology again, staying on fire, with the fire apparatus, it says there are 8 units, and then it lists out the unit cost. Is that new equipment?
Yeah.
So the current level of service is not new equipment. So wouldn't you depreciate I mean, if our fire engine is 10 years old, should the new subdivision have to buy a brand new one, or can they buy used equipment that would be the equivalent level of service?
Well, you don't, when you do fire impact fees or police impact fees, when you value the asset under the increment, well, actually any of the fees, when you value the asset, it's based on what it would cost to build new. So then there's a subject, and it's more cut and dried on the vehicles because it's expanding the fleet.
But you could expand the fleet without purchasing new vehicles.
Who really does that, though?
A budget-conscious city?
But that's not what happens with most of the cities we work with, and it's our understanding that's not how the city does business here. If they need a new pumper, they buy a new pumper. And with police vehicles, it's the cost of the police vehicle new, with the equipment loaded in, the computer, et cetera. Now, where it gets more subjective is when it comes to valuing the bricks and mortar for police or fire, or to your point earlier about parks, is that, if it's clear that the city's, the standard that they build a fire station to is, using Marshall and Swift valuation terminology, if it's a good Class C construction, we don't want to make the cost assumption good Class A, because to your point, you're feathering your nest. You're building a Taj Mahal fire station when that's not what we provide as a city. And it's the same with parks. If the standard baseball field just has bleachers and no lights, if that's what the majority of them are, we shouldn't have the assumption in the fee methodology as one with lights, stadium seating, a bathroom, and a concession stand, right? It should be reflective of what we provide as a community. But it is based on using a consumption-based approach, what it costs to replace the assets that you provide today.
So one question I have is there a third party that is going to look at all these numbers and give us their opinion? Because obviously the city is motivated to increase them to the maximum. You're being paid by the city. Your job is to make the city happy. So who is the third unattached party that's going to look at these numbers? Because I don't know what a fire truck costs, but this seems like a lot. Who's going to tell me that is a reasonable number?
Good question. So oftentimes the development community does hire a third party. For instance, when we do a lot of fees, as you can imagine, in the Phoenix area, and the Home Builders Association there is very active. Every city we work with, they're part of the review. Their representative there is very savvy. He's the best one we've worked with in the country in terms of reviews. Sometimes we agree to disagree, but there's always a good conversation. There oftentimes, the builders get together and hire another firm like DPFG that reviews our studies. So that's not uncommon. But you have to remember, and we certainly don't mind if you farm our study out for review, but you've got to remember, we try to be fair. We've got our reputation to think of. We're the only firm that's never been successfully sued, and that's because of the careful scrutiny we give to the product. But yeah, feel free to have a third set of eyes look at it. One
more question I have is, so what if I'll use an example of the splash pad in the Parks Department, which was provided not by the city, but by the community and community fundraising, and that wasn't provided by the city. Are they allowed to include that as something that they've?
Yeah, so here's and that's a common question. So, for instance, we worked with a lot of communities where, and Parks is the perfect example of that, where historically grant funding had been attained to fund a large portion of the infrastructure. And so the question comes, well, if the city didn't pay for this asset base, can you include it in the impact fee? And the answer is yes, if in the future, the city's going to have to be the one to provide that infrastructure. Now, if that relationship exists, and we've had to incorporate this into fee studies, where it's going to be a combination, where, yeah, we know we're going to be building these things, and we're actively pursuing these grants, like in Colorado, they're called DOLA grants. We're actively going to go after this DOLA money. So what then you have to do is you have to look at, well, let's look at all the infrastructure you've built over the last 10 years. How much of it was a city share versus a DOLA grant share, and make that assumption so that maybe 64 cents of every dollar is a city cost. But that's not the situation we have here. But that is a situation that comes up.
My name is Charmaine. I just want to thank you for being very clear on how you speak, because it helps to understand what everything going on. But what I wanted to ask is that when we went through this back in 2008, it was about 2006, and we had we were in the black. We were doing really well. I came to the finance meeting, and it showed that we were really progressing in Kingman. Our numbers were up. That I recall when I was here. And then after they did this whole impact thing, it went bad, really quick for everybody. Well, I've been in the real estate business for 30 years, with my family for 30 years. And we are at that point where we can see a correction every 10 years. It cycles. And I just wanted to see if you guys would do an impact study on the timing, because the timing is bad. It's like putting a retirement fund in when you start a retirement fund at 80 years old. It doesn't make sense. It's late in the game to me. And what happened last time that I remember, I was just asked that you do the study on what happened last time 10 years, 12 years ago, whatever. It wasn't healthy for our city.
Well, I mean, I'll tip to answer that, Tina. You can chip in if you want. But I think, shortly after the city adopted the last impact fees, the Great Recession happened. And so the other thing that's interesting is that, so over that time, the city may have been in the black, but the reason the city's in the red now has nothing, or it's a lot of factors are contributing to that. One is the change in the retail market that we've seen over the last 12 years that have drastically affected sales tax collections. You have COVID right now, obviously, but local government revenues are just reaching, as of this year, their pre-recession levels in terms of real dollars. And that's because of a myriad of factors, including the retail, but also the fact that the feds and the state have cut off so much money to the local governments, and the local governments don't want to raise their taxes. And so they're just now getting back to their pre-recession levels of revenue. And so, as you can imagine, the city is in a different situation now as it relates to its capital budget and needs the impact fees. Whether or not we have a correction or not, I mean, the impact fees aren't going to drive that. And I mean, I would have said 3 years ago that we would have had a recession by now. So, I mean, none of us have a crystal ball, and that's more of a political decision. It's not part of our job to do a market study to see when a correction is going to happen.
Yeah, the impact fees did drive that, actually. I was here. We were all here. the impact fees did drive that. People pulled out, builders pulled out, the commercial that was planned pulled out. I was here, I worked it. And also, and I'm just saying these are things that we really need to look at because it can be devastating on everybody. We had builders, 80% of our builders went bankrupt.
But not because of the impact fees.
It had largely because of the impact fees. That isn't correct. It was largely because of the impact fees, because the cost drove them away, or what they were projected, they stopped doing what they were going to project to do because of the impact fees. It doesn't impact just, and this is just, it didn't, I'm just saying, I'm not a builder. I'm just saying it didn't impact the community in a positive way then. So I was saying maybe we can look into what happened then, because when these builders, and it doesn't just the builders, it was Home Depot, it was True Value, it was everybody's affected. And so it isn't just, what happened, in my opinion, is it affected the city negatively, and it also affected our community negative. And yes, when we went to the very bottom in 2010, you can't help but drive up. When you're at the very bottom, there's only one place to look. So yeah, over the last 10 years, we've been in a positive driven, but that's because it's just the natural cycle of real estate and construction and such. And then, and so when these builders and everybody are affected by that, you know, is anybody going back to them to give them money because now they have lost everything? You know, and they did. I mean, I could go back to my office and name 10 builders that went bankrupt. At least 10 personally that I know. So I am not a builder. I am none, but I do just asking that they go back to that time and understand how damaging it was. It wasn't, and we have gotten so much positive based on, I mean, there's been a lot of good things that have happened to Kingman since we've been coming out of this just by revenues, and maybe it's not enough, but it can be worse. And we are, you know, statistics show, if you look in the real estate market and construction market, you know, we are at our 10-year time when we can see a correction in the future.
Yeah. Can I encourage you to make those views known during the adoption process?
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
Is there or can there be, you know, call it maybe an escape hatch in one of these? So like we're making quite a lot of assumptions. But let's say, just for a number's sake, we're assuming that 300 permits a year is kind of a baseline, and we predict it's going to go up dramatically over the. What if next year's 200 and the year after that's 150? Is there any? I remember impact fees last time, and I can't say that drawing a straight line that says the impact fees caused the great what happened, but didn't help. So is there a mechanism that would say, hey, when we get to 150, maybe we need to reconsider this because it's not producing what it needed to, and it's having a dramatic effect? Does that exist, or have you created?
You don't build that into the study. Obviously, that's a policy decision that, you know, the council can say, well, you know, God, we screwed the pooch on this one. Let's reconvene. You know, but yeah, so that's always something. I mean, the impact fees aren't locked in like a bond referendum where, you know, you've got to do this for 8 years and then it sunsets. At any point in time, the council could choose to, you know, pull the plug, so to speak.
So I would say that it's not necessarily political. I know that we are committed to looking at impact fees roughly every 5 years to make sure that the marks are being hit. And if there were dramatic differences, it may even shrink to 3 years. But the general rule is to look at those, 3 to 5 years, hopefully more like 5 years, to make sure that course correction is being made correctly and in a timely manner. So.
And by law, in the act, it is every 5 years now. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm gonna say the word waiver, I don't know if that's the right vernacular, but a waiver, or maybe what you're describing as a development agreement, where at some point, if a piece of infrastructure was put in, you felt it was worthy of a reduction in impact fees attached to a particular project, who is the person? Because I took one of my major sources of contention last time with impact fees was how they were applied. They weren't equally applied. When a car dealership here in town wanted to get its impact fee, we didn't call it retail. We called it warehouse. Or when Kingman Academy of Learning wanted to add 20,000 square feet to their facility, we did a waiver because the city of Kingman has access to their auditorium. So seemed like it was a person that would get to decide where those lines stop. And it seemed like my projects weren't in the line that were considered. Right. So who is that person, or how do we accommodate? How is that going to be applied?
So I've seen cities get in trouble with exactly what you're talking about. And so in the adoption of impact fees for the city of Kingman, the key ingredient in this is that we're fair and consistent. And I told when this presentation was made to the city council last night, that very question came up from one of the councilors. And the answer to that is that one of the places where we can't be messing around is, or getting janky with impact fees, is that we've got to be fair and consistent. And if it's office space, it's office space. If it's retail space, it's retail space. And what I told the council, and what my recommendation to the council will always be, is that if you want to give a reduction in fees, you want to waive building fees, or you want to waive inspection fees, okay, but you don't mess around with impact fees, because impact fees are basically there to build the infrastructure. And as soon as you waive an impact fee, reduce it, change someone, a grocery store all of a sudden is being charged some lesser amount because you really wanted that grocery store here. We can't be involved in that. That's not going to be a recommendation that comes from the city administration, and it's going to be something that we highlight as important as we move forward, of being fair and consistent. So ultimately, that decision, you ask who the person is, ultimately those decisions are being boiled out at the council level, because you want to play with impact fees. That's ultimately where they have to be reduced or changed. And our recommendation will be that as soon as you change an impact fee for somebody, you're basically loading that on to the backs of somebody else. And there's a fairness issue that has to be taken into account. So that's how I've dealt with impact fees my entire career. And ultimately, like I said, giving credit where credit's due, it's come up a couple times, needs to happen. But forgiving or changing the rules on it, it's not fair. And you're absolutely right, Travin. Somebody builds a project, they don't get rewarded for it. Somebody else comes in and you sell the farm to get them here. There's a fairness issue that's got to be considered, and ultimately that would follow the city council. From the team's perspective, we are not going to be making those kind of recommendations because it is a fairness issue.
Is there any consideration or like part of this analysis of what we're kind of a unique situation? We got the greater Kingman area, we got the city of Kingman providing water and sewer to a lot of that area, but then just outside that area, we have county. And this essentially would make a property in the city of Kingman, I mean, theoretically maybe worth a little bit more, and then create these spots just outside this limit. So is that what if that is that? Do you have experience with that, of where you've created these pockets or these almost new markets?
Yeah, obviously, if the county doesn't have an impact fee program, then you can make the argument that it's cheaper to develop there. But there's reasons why people want to live in the city, and I've been doing this 30 years, and you're going to get certain instances where some development will go to the county, and that's just going to happen. But there is a reason businesses want to locate in Kingman. There's a reason people want to live in Kingman, and we have not seen any empirical evidence that suggests that impact fees make development leave your community. Development fees don't make development dry up. We've not seen any of that anywhere in the country. And in fact, in the heyday before the recession in the Phoenix area, in Queen Creek, every time their impact fees were raised, permits even actually went up. And so, I mean, just the fact that at any given point in time, our firm has 60 to 70 impact fee jobs going is an indication that impact fees do not drive away development. There's a reason people want to locate in certain places.
Just to put numbers to what Travin is saying, I mean, if you just use supply and demand, they clearly will drive away development, because just looking at the extra sales tax that we pay on a house in the city, along with these development fees, I estimate on a $200,000 house, the city will cost nearly $14,000 more. There are points in the county all over that are closer to our infrastructure than city neighborhoods. So it's not a matter of distance. And we already, Angle Homes, the largest builder in Kingman, more than 45% of our homes are in the county. And we're seeing that grow. And that's because right now it's just the 2.5% sales tax that is the difference. And just that 2.5% makes our two most popular communities county communities. And so has the city thought about how they could actually lose revenue by driving out and losing that sales tax, losing those permit fees, and decreasing the number of homes built here? They could lose revenue that they think they're going to get from these development fees. The other question I have, and maybe I know that this is, we're going to talk about this in a later meeting. This might lean towards politics a little bit more, but we are already as a city struggling to entice retail to come to the Kingman Crossings interchange that is trying to be built. We're trying to get new stores, more infrastructure, and we cannot get it. No one right now is signing up to come. So has the city thought about how this is going to impact and make it that much more difficult to entice companies to come to Kingman?
So I would say that we understand where we are with COVID and the attraction of retail. And the idea that impact fees would keep retail from coming to Kingman is not been part of the calculation. We think that these people face these exact same costs in every other community, or a majority of the communities that they're locating in. They're used to seeing this as part of the conversation of locating. We're certainly not looking to retard the commercial development, and any advantage that we can, we're looking for. But impact fees, again, I think that if you look across the country, these places in retail, whatever company you want to use, have been part of conversations and are used to having conversations about impact fee and cost of development.
I love Kingman, don't get me wrong. It's been a great place for my family, but it's no Queen Creek, and the customers coming here are very budget. People buying homes are budget conscious clients. They're not coming for the amazing parks that we have here in Kingman or the infrastructure that we have.
Thank you. You just made our argument for us.
No,
This really is about livability and having that piece that you're talking about. And that's the question is, what's the difference between Queen Creek and what's the difference between Kingman?
but you have to leave the same level of service. So you can't tell me that the development fees are going to increase the level of service, because that's illegal.
Right.
So we aren't
Right.
going to become Queen Creek. It's just going to become more of Kingman. Or are you saying that this is designed to increase the level of service?
I'm saying that it's designed to help livability.
I mean, because you're not, one thing's for sure, if you don't have a good infrastructure system, you're not gonna have a place to market at all. And so development fees are gonna help you tread water in terms of staying where you are. And believe me, I am not, I hope you don't think that I am, not sensitive to your plight or being facetious in my comments, but I've heard this exact same argument about, Missoula, Montana, where Ben and I are working now. The same thing, the same argument. We've had that discussion with them all 3 times over the last 20 years that we have done work for them on development fees. Oh, it's so much, less expensive in Missoula County. Everybody's going to move to Missoula County. It's not happening.
So in Kingman, the boundaries,
I may be wrong.
the boundaries are just so wonky. I don't know if you've looked at a map,
I have,
but
yeah.
it's not square or round, and so there's lots of places that are in the county that are interior parts of what a normal person would assume
Right.
is
They're
part
shadow-
of Kingman.
yeah,
So can I just say, we need to pull this back to the study itself. This is a public hearing conversation that we're involved with, not necessarily the study. So,
So, and I'll give the mic back. The last thing I wanted to ask, so you said you were going to revisit all the information and numbers specifically related to the Parks Department. So will another one of these be released, or how will we get that information prior to the next public hearing?
Yeah, so how I envision this is we will reconvene with city staff and make any subsequent, any revisions to this, and there would be another draft that comes out. Because, that's one of the reasons you have that long advertisement and public hearing process, so you can get this input and release other, or, multiple drafts if needed.
I was wondering, it's kind of for city staff, but before the last round of development fees were implemented, the fee for a water meter was less than $500. Then we had the development fees implemented for a while. Then when those were taken away, the water meter fee spiked up. So some of that development fee charge was shifted. Wastewater kept, a development fee on it that we've already talked about, but the water fee went up like $2,000 from what the pre-development fee was. So I wonder if that's been considered, or that's going to be taken back away, or why that development fee for the water isn't really being considered.
So we did look at the meter connection fee, and chose to keep it as is and not bring it into the development impact fee study. When we talked it over with Tischler Bice and looked at the current fee, we felt that it was reasonable as is and did not bring it into this study. We're looking at just the impact fees.
So I realize none of us were directly involved in that, but it seems like if the water meter charge went up because of development fees back then, that maybe they need to go back down since we're implementing development fees now.
So really, the meter connection fee is similar to a wastewater capacity fee. It's the same sort of fee where it's paying for expansion and growth related projects.
Saying it's properly adjusted now.
we kept it that way because we provide water. I'm, looking back, I obviously wasn't here. But we provide water service both inside and outside the city limits. So they just set that rate to cover the cost of that. And of course, because we do inside and outside the city, it wouldn't qualify for an impact fee anyway.
So we have to use the same statute that we're using for the capacity fee.
Is it like an agreed assumption that impact fees do increase the cost of real estate? I mean, we all agree that implementing this is going to affect the cost of, whether that's affordability of single-family homes and/or the development of commercial property.
Certainly. And our research indicates that it really, who bears the cost depends on what economic cycle you're in, largely. If you're in a robust economy, 100% or more gets passed on to the home builder, because you guys certainly have carrying costs associated with that. And, when you're in a down economy, the person who sells the land sells it for less money per acre, you take less profit, the homeowner pays a portion. So it's really, it depends on the cycle you're in, but certainly it's going to increase the cost to do business, right?
Yeah, the National Association of Home Builders says that it increases by 137% when a development fee is implemented, that the builders, I don't know about have to, but end up on average raising the costs 130, or the price 137% to cover for sales tax on top of that additional development fee, right, that they're now paying, and insurance and overhead and all that. So it actually affects costs in the end more than just a one-for-one.
Any other technical questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
What's our estimate? Hold on, Keith, we won't be able to hear you. I don't have paperwork they got, I didn't print it out. What is the estimated cost per house for impact?
Yeah, it's right here, sir. When you add in the general fund fees as well as the capacity fees, it's about $9,355.
What was it last time?
I don't.
So it was 2,852 for the general, and then when you add the wastewater in at an average of about 1,500, so $4,300. Back the city.
Back in 2006.
Yeah, that's what it was. That's everything. That's what about $4,300.
I just remember, it was a bad time, and it's hard to pass it on. There was a lot of contractors, there wasn't buyers. I mean, it wasn't just the impact piece of it, but it didn't help. But on the commercial side of it, I was getting ready to build buildings for my contractor. It was $55,000. I'm in the neighborhood that I've already paid. I paid for the sewer and the water in, and I waited for the improvement district for the gutter sidewalk and pavement. I was still going to pay $55,000. That sure hurt my appetite to build a building. So we're still in the same little building. So I think these commercial are just going to kill us. We're looking at Kingman Crossing, we're looking at actual Santa Fe Parkway. I personally don't have an issue with making a small impact fee with this $1,000, but I just think commercial wise it's going to kill us. We really need to look.
You will have a chance.
Anything else? If not, thank you very much for your input. Very valuable. And the city will be in contact for a follow-up meeting at a certain point where we can share with you
Yeah.
the revisions that we've
Yeah,
made.
and that was a question asked. Once we get the numbers, I mean, again, thank you as we wrap up for coming. The feedback's important. We want to have these conversations. We want to understand if there's confusion or if there's an opportunity to look at the numbers to make sure we got them right. And what we will do is once we get reworked numbers or any changes, we'll invite you again to a meeting just like this and continue the conversation. That's what we want to do. We want to make it as open dialogue as we possibly can and understand, and because we know this does directly affect you folks. That's why we call it the stakeholders meeting. So really appreciate your input, your feedback, and really your insight on it. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.